Hello and welcome to the seminar. I've decided to record this seminar in advance for folks that couldn't make it to the seminar or people that might want to watch it afterwards. And it's a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. The question is, did remote teaching force us to actually improve education? By having us go to a remote teaching model, did it force us to start thinking about the different ways that we could use technology in order to teach better? Did it help integrate more UDL principles into the way that we delivered education? Not because we necessarily weren't heading down that path, but we sort of got a bit of a kick in the pants. We wound up having to do this because we had no choice when we all of a sudden found ourselves remote teaching. And that's really what this seminar is all about. It's really looking at the past 2 years, some of the things that I know I personally learned, and some of the lessons that I hope that I can share with you. So when we talk about working with remote teaching and such, there's 4 different areas that I wanted to talk about in this seminar, and that is, what happened, what caused us to first have to go indoors. I think we all know what happened that made us first go indoors and such, but it wasn't necessarily something new, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But it was something that came suddenly and was forced upon us. I wanted to talk about the fact that students are still wanting to succeed. They still want to learn. We still had students in our classes. Now, it's going to depend on what you were teaching. In some cases, students were more or less engaged, and really we have to look at ways to engage students across multiple mediums. But it is interesting that the world still continued to move forward, and people, in many cases, use that time away from a traditional classroom to improve their skills because they could do so remotely and from home. And obviously, technology became a critical tool in order for that to happen. And I want to talk a little bit about what I did with technology and some of the ways that I tried to share some of the things that I was learning and some of the things that I knew in order to make sure that it was working. Drink of water here. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that I really sort of embraced a lot of the principles of UDL and used that as a way to design my courses so that people could participate in different ways. I especially wanted to make sure that there wasn't just one delivery model, the Zoom meeting or the Teams meeting. I wanted to make sure that students had different ways of participating. So in terms of themes for this particular seminar, I'm going to talk about what does it mean to switch to remote teaching for me, my students, the courses that I was teaching specifically, what technologies did I turn to in order to help myself, my colleagues, and my students, what challenges did I face because of that, and then also specifically how this really tied into UDL and 21st century skills, if I could add those in there. But there is an argument to be made that 21st century skills are really just good skills for learning, and they've been around for a lot longer than the 21st century. So the first thing that happened is we had a school day. And we've all had snow days or inclement weather days or reasons why the school has been closed temporarily. Maybe it's 1 day, 2 days, maybe as long as a week. I know that where I live, we often do have large snowfalls. We actually know how to deal with large snowfalls, so we don't have very many school days, but we get a lot of snow. But I do remember we did have some days with massive flooding, and we did have some days with massive snow where we did have to resort to new ways of teaching our students. And we could adapt. We could adapt to that really easily. The problem is we weren't used to something that was going to last 2 years. So we didn't really anticipate that this was going to last as long as it did. Although when we did wind up going to remote teaching, it was a decision to close things down for a longer period of time. So it wasn't just a day, a snow day, a inclement weather day. It was something that we had to deal with on a long-term basis. But although the pattern of how students went to class changed, the purpose of those students still remained. The students still wanted to learn. They still wanted to receive a quality education. And that was really important because they had chosen to come to the institution where I teach because they wanted to get a lot of hands-on knowledge. They wanted to be able to practice their skill sets. They wanted to have that instructor interaction. And it's very important to understand that there's a big difference between a distance or an online delivery model and a remote teaching model. We'll go into that a little bit further. So what we had to do is we really had to adapt. And that was the big thing. We had to find ways to adapt our teaching and our training to make sure that we were still meeting all of the different objectives. And there is an argument to be made that maybe we should be adapting our teaching to every student every time. So this was really a forced adaptation, but it was still an adaptation that had to happen. And what we did is we didn't just reinvent and rebuild everything from scratch. What we ended up doing is we said, look, let's take what we already know how to do. Let's see which of those things that we can easily move into an online environment, and then how can we either replicate or replace those things that really did in the previous world, the non-remote world. It had to be on hands-on. And there were definitely, certainly where I teach, some programs that was just simply impossible to teach remotely. So for example, how to bake bread is, a baking program or a culinary program. There's a lot of theoretical courses that you could adapt. And then you still had to bring people onto the campus in order to practice the hands-on skills. There's one thing to say, we're going to be able to teach theoretical or mathematics or even some fairly complex topics that do require a lot of hands-on if we can get the lab equipment to the students. So for example, it could be anything from a network, a simulated network environment, a cloud-based environment, which a lot of things are moving towards anyways when it comes to computer science. But what about things like, baking or welding or plumbing? Some of these technical skills absolutely require the hands-on. So we had to adapt what we could adapt, and then we had to find alternative delivery methods or ways of utilizing our spaces to adapt to the reduction in amount of people that can actually be in a classroom environment. Now, it's important to understand, though, that we were not reinventing or changing what we were doing. So it wasn't really a matter of saying we're now going to be an online or a distance learning facility. We did remote teaching. And there's a big difference between an online or distance education and a remote teaching. First of all, generally speaking, an online or a distance education is something that's delivered asynchronously. So it's something where the student can come in at any time and get to the material, watch the presentations, look at the lab material, even through discussion forums, collaborate with other students. Whereas with remote teaching, we tended to blend both the synchronous delivery, a lecture time where students would attend the lecture, and an asynchronous delivery. And it was that synchronous component of remote teaching that really became important, because what it did is it created a sense of you need to be in class. And maybe that class was being done through Zoom or through Teams, some remote delivery technology, but it still created an appointment for the students. But it also, through the use of recording those lectures, did give us the ability to provide asynchronous opportunities. So if a student was feeling unwell, or if a student had to attend to children or had to attend to personal things that they needed to do, a doctor's appointment, a dentist appointment, we could provide them with the opportunity to not have to participate synchronously in each and every case. Now, it was good practice with remote teaching to have some understanding that you would be there for a certain amount of synchronous activities, and we've coordinate that through things like group work and such, but it was a combination of synchronous and asynchronous, where generally speaking, an online class or distance education tends to be pretty much asynchronous. The thing with an online and distance is we have self-directed learners. These are learners that want to learn, so they're actually moving towards the course. Whereas in remote teaching, we do have some mixed learners. We have some learners that require that synchronous structure, classes at 9 a.m. every day. Some were happy to be able to do that from their basement or their home. Some were quite lost or didn't have the necessary equipment at home in order to do that. So there was, in order to transition and adapt, a transition period or a period of time where we had to make sure that everybody was able to participate, either through the loan of computer equipment or through other facilities that we could, or mechanisms that we could use in order to ensure that everybody was able to participate. And we had to really sort of look at whether or not we were going to look at alternative ways of delivering, or whether we were going to look at ways to provide the resources that may have been lacking. So for example, with the remote teaching, if someone did not have a web camera and a web camera was part of the remote teaching, rather than give them an alternative to a web camera, we actually got them a web camera. Sort of making sure that sometimes you remediate, sometimes you have to look at alternatives. Now, with the online and distance learning, because it is a self-directed learner that has the flexibility to sign up easily, to participate or not participate, there is a historically low graduation rate from multiple online, massively open online courses, MOOCs. I had to think of what MOOCs meant all of a sudden, but massively open online courses and things like Coursera, Skillshare, they can get a lot of people to sign up, but the completion rate tends to be quite low. Whereas with remote teaching, because there's an instructor there to guide the process, because there is a synchronous as well as the asynchronous element, it does create a sense of flow and a timeline. And that hopefully led to much more graduation. I know in the courses that I was teaching, everybody made it through, so that was good. Now, I will say I teach technical data analysis courses, so I do have a student body that is more mature, a little bit older. It's a postgraduate program, and it is something where the hands-on component is through software. So that's something that whether they run a computer screen at home or remotely, it doesn't matter. However, obviously, there would be a different scenario if this was a hands-on course like baking, like I said, or welding. And in terms of online classes for distance learning, a lot of times what we have is it's just a series of courses. And this actually can be a bit of a challenge if we replicate that mechanism in our remote teaching. We have to understand that we have cohorts. When it comes to remote teaching, even though people are taking the same class and maybe taking multiple classes, we have to make sure that someone, and that's usually the institution or a lead instructor or someone, takes responsibility for skilling everybody on the basic skills of learning remotely. So, for example, I had a number of different tools that I used in order to make that happen. I'll talk about those in a moment. So the first thing that I did when we went into this remote teaching is I said, okay, I need to put my classroom into a remote environment. So to define terms, I had to say, what is a classroom? What comprises a classroom? And I boiled it down to a classroom contains resources. So if I could catalog those resources, then what I could do is I could then look to replicate or replace those resources in the remote teaching setting. A classroom contains technology. Now, in our case, we had already moved to a bring your own device model. So that was fortuitous for us because students were required as part of the program requirements to have a computer of a certain type with internet access. So that would be something in some environments that would be a huge obstacle that would have to be remediated before we could do remote teaching. Or we would have to provide some facility where even though they might be remote to the main campus, there might be satellite campuses that they could use. Now, in the case of our 2-year lockdown, that wasn't possible at all because we weren't allowed to be in public spaces. So that meant we had to get computers to those students who didn't have computers. In many cases for the K-12, for example, or shared computers, we had to take all of that into consideration, which is a big part of UDL, but ensuring that you have the right resources. But in my case, technology was less of a hurdle. There were some webcam issues. We dealt with those. We also need to make sure that in a classroom, we have a community. So there's a sense of space. There's a sense of once you pass that threshold of the classroom, you're there to learn. So what I needed to do in my own teaching was make sure that we had a community and I was able to utilize technology, specifically Microsoft Teams, to create that community. So I didn't just use a tool such as Zoom for meetings. I actually ended up using Microsoft Teams because it gave me both the meeting capabilities as well as the community aspects, a shared collaborative space. And it was also important to understand that communities are built through interactions and communities are built through activities. So each day or several times a day even, we would have not just the learning activities, but we'd have to have community building, remote community building activities so that we could create relationships with each other, even though we were remote from each other. And obviously, classrooms have instructors, and I was the instructor there. And in some ways, being remote provided me the opportunity to have a more one-on-one or one-on-a-few group meetings where I was able to have sort of a meeting with a student without other students listening in. So I was able to be approached by students that may have been struggling, and they would not have wanted to approach me in a traditional classroom where other people might be able to hear what they're struggling with. So there were some actual benefits to the remote teaching in that regard there as well. And then, of course, classrooms have a structure, and we needed to replicate or have that structure in the remote teaching as well. So once I defined what a classroom was, then I could go and look for all of the ways to replace, enhance, and make sure that I still had a classroom, although a remote classroom. And to do that, I had to work with student perceptions. So the idea is that a lot of students thought, you know what, if I'm doing remote, I'm doing online. And they have their traditional ideas of what online or what distance education is. Now, for students that were sort of pulled out of classroom, that was probably the hardest thing for them to deal with, because they came in with an expectation that they would be coming to class, and then they were pulled and pushed into a remote expectation. So they may have set things up in their own lives so that they would be going to school and then they would come home and there would be no interruptions. Now all of a sudden they found themselves in their home with their kids, with their spouses and partners and everything, and they found themselves, okay, I am distracted. There are some problems here. So their perceptions and expectations, there was a disconnect. So what we had to do is re-educate them in terms of expectations and perceptions. So what I needed to do was constantly reinforce that this is the classroom. And so, how I helped them by setting up some systems that were first, replicating classroom elements. And then second of all, I spent some time orienting them towards working in that environment and giving them the opportunity to set up their home environments, their remote environment, so that they would be able to succeed. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. For the technology, I myself chose Microsoft Teams. Now, there is other technologies that we have. D2L, or the Learning Management System that we had access to, I think is a fantastic tool for helping a student through a course, but I don't feel it creates a centralized platform where they can do the community or the replication of all of the classroom elements. So it's less in the configuration of D2L so that we can have more conversational or chance meetings or student control of setting up meetings. There's a lot of things that are external. So you might have, D2L, and then you have to launch Zoom to participate in this part of the class. And then you have to go here to participate in the discussions. And you have to go here to see your assignments. Microsoft Teams is not different from that in that there are different areas for each of those activities, but it is all just one login. And then you can go through channels where you have discussions. You can set up private channels for group meetings. I wound up going to Microsoft Teams and setting up quite a bit in terms of discussion channels, group channels, team channels, interest channels. And then I tried my very best to, provide some sort of activity in those channels to encourage students to talk about things beyond what we would normally do in the course material, but that we would always do in the classroom. So in the classroom, we would always talk about, what was it like to watch this movie, or I saw this great TV show. What do you think of that? So I wanted to create that sort of informal conversation, and Teams lent itself well to that. I also was able to allow students to have quite a bit of control. They could start their own team meetings with each other. They could have small group discussions. They could share files, practice files, work together at night. Now, this was interesting because I know that my students, when I'm in a regular classroom, I always encourage them to set things up outside of the class so that they can help each other with homework. And that is, in a way, a remote classroom as well. So they often will set up a Slack or a Discord server. Teams provided that same sort of environment, plus all the other great stuff. And the big thing is that it created that single destination for them. So it was one place they could go. They could get notes, conversations, all sorts of cool stuff. And for the vast majority of students, it was very familiar to them because it was a Microsoft product. So they were comfortable with that environment. Although it was a different Microsoft product, a lot of the features and the navigation was familiar to them, and that was beneficial. I also created some other resources. A big thing for myself, I created a YouTube channel called Learning and Technology with Frank. And I also created some other YouTube resources. I found other YouTube resources that I could share with my students. But my own channel, every time I came across something that I learned that was useful and new, I try to make a video on it. I was trying to provide as many resources as I could, not just for myself, my students, my colleagues where I teach, but I also wanted to create a lot of resources globally. And, I did quite well. Like I've over 2 million views, almost 22,000 subscribers. So it's really grown quite a bit, my YouTube channel. It's something I actually am happy that I started, and the purpose may have changed. Now I'm doing a lot of teaching and technology things, but, at first it was just, hey, we all need some help here. Let me give you as much help as I can. I've continued with that, but obviously different circumstances in terms of it's not as, for lack of a better term, desperate, right? It's something where it's like, you need to know this right now and you're stuck. It's more like, hey, did you know you could do this? It's pretty cool. So my YouTube channel, you can see my early videos. One of the earliest videos, I had this YouTube channel for many years. It was just at one point I had created a little video for my students on how to create a virtual machine with SQL Server, because I kept getting that question in class all the time. But my first real video was the Microsoft Teams whiteboard video. And then, I did a number of videos on the Microsoft whiteboard. And then I started doing a number of videos on Microsoft Teams. Some of these I've, since delisted because the versions have changed, or so you can see some of them are unlisted. But, I put a lot of basic videos, and they were very basic. But you know what? They got a lot of views because they served a need. Now I have to polish my videos a little bit more, and, we'll see how that goes. So one of the things that I created almost immediately was a student orientation. So what I did is, by creating a student orientation to Teams, I could preload my students before they came to class being that remote class. So about a week before students were to start the class, I gave them this video to watch. I made them a member of the Microsoft team, which I had set up in advance as our classroom. And then what I did is I did some of the activities myself, an introductory video, an introductory post, and then I gave them time. I gave them a week's worth of time before they had the pressure of having to learn the subject we were studying. I gave them the ability to experience the environment they would be in. So some students, of course, saved it right to the very end before they did it, and some students were able to become comfortable with the environment so that when we entered into a learning activity environment, they had already understood the classroom environment. Today, if you take a student in a physical environment, everybody kind of understands what a classroom is. You just have to look at your timetable, find out what room it's in. You walk in, you find a place to sit. We've been trained to do that. It's always interesting. I sort of, in my own mind, I imagined that everybody was going back to kindergarten. And kindergarten, you have to go to the first day, and your parent sits with you, and you get to know your teacher, and you get to know what a chair is and what a desk is and all the different parts of school, and everybody's excited. And to some extent, we train children before they go to school because we have a lot of TV shows for children that involve classrooms. But the point here is I had to go back. I had to go back to that level of training that let my students know we have an electronic classroom now. So I did a student overview on Microsoft Teams, gave everybody the opportunity, and I just created a few little exercises like change your profile picture. So instead of just your initials, it was a picture of you. It's something, do an introductory post. You could do either an audio file, you could do a video, you could do a written post, whatever worked for you. And this is also part of the UDL sort of principles, give them multiple ways to express themselves and demonstrate proof of knowledge or proof of completion. So this was a popular video. A lot of other places around the world started using this one as well. It's a little dated now because it's 2 years old, but it was a student overview that I was able to use. So my process to set everybody up was to create that Teams environment, then orient my students to that environment with low-risk activities, apply different UDL principles to make sure that everybody can succeed in those activities. So they could do a post, an audio, a picture, a video, whatever they felt most comfortable with. Then as time went on, I would add new capabilities, provide new skills. I'd scaffold the skills. I wouldn't just throw them into the deep end all at once. Now you have to learn this new technology and we're going to study physics, right? Or in my case, data science. So it was something where they were already familiar, they'd already had some experience with the environment, and then we could concentrate on the actual learning outcomes. And then as we captured the results of how things were working for them, and there's a lot of tools within Teams to do things like reflections, to see how the students are feeling, to do things like data capture, so I could capture when they're logging in, what time they're logging in, how long are they logging in, whether they're attending the synchronous sessions, whether they're watching those videos after the fact. There's a good data set in there, and then I could incorporate that into the process. I also used external resources. So I've got a whole data sheet of different books and my social link websites. But one of the things that I had a lot of students go to is the Coursera course, Learning How to Learn. And this is by Barbara Oakley. She's written a couple of books, Learning How to Learn, The Uncommon Sense Teaching, some really good books. Those are in the bibliography. I'll give you a PDF of that, or there'll be a PDF attached somewhere here. But the point here is that by having students go and complete this course, Learning How to Learn, which I actually used to have them do for years. I've had them do this course. So the idea is that a lot of people in my environment were returning to school as opposed to continuing school or in the middle of school. So for myself, giving people some of the skill sets on how we learn and learning how to learn helps leverage their time in class to better outcomes. So I would recommend this course. I can't assign it just because of the nature. You can't assign another course within your course. That's kind of bad form. But any student that was struggling, and the feedback I have received from my students on thank you so much for letting us know about Learning How to Learn, it has changed everything for me. It is significant. It's a statistical outlier that this course receives a lot of positive feedback when I direct my students to it. I also have a lot of external resources like Microsoft Learn, Coursera, Skillshare. Some of them are free, some of them have a small fee to them. So again, I don't make it required, but it is a resource that they can go. And it actually all comes down to this whole thing I do with my students called All About You. And what I'll do with the All About You is give them, an understanding of the classrooms, the facilities, the technology, the library, all of the different types of resources. Now, all of this is something I've been doing for years and years, but I adapted it to the remote teaching. So for example, counseling was a really big issue during the last 2 years. So I made sure that we understood, don't wait to ask for help. Things like sports and recreation. Obviously, we weren't going out and playing team sports, but I did, for example, I had a small little ice breaking activity where I took some bands. I don't have them here, so I can't show you here on the video. They're sitting over at the door, but I showed people, how to do desk stretches. And that was, again, an icebreaker activity. It was a way of creating a remote classroom feeling as opposed to just a learning environment. And we were able to create some, health habits in some students so that, and I'd also build in stretching breaks and all sorts of things like that. I won't go through all of this. It's something that usually takes 1 or 2 days in order for me to go through it. And I am fortunate in that I have a cohort of students that I was able to teach. So I am the lead instructor for a specific program, and I end up teaching the majority of the courses within that program. So I can both plant seeds and harvest crops, so to speak, throughout the entire program. And I can set the students up by taking some time to do things like the All About You. This is something that theoretically should be institutionally implemented so that any student taking any type of course at the institution should go through an orientation that is comprehensive. And it should be maybe a common orientation. Some of them will be unique to the programs. For example, I have building virtual labs would be unique to my program. Software for students might be unique to anybody who uses software. Although the number of times that I've taught a night class or a continuing education class, and I've said, oh, why don't you just go get all the free software? And they go, what free software? I'm like, well, as a student, you get all this free software. And they're like, I did not know that, right? So this should be, anyways, well, that's another seminar at another point in time. So what ended up happening is I unlocked opportunity by being put into that remote teaching situation. And I was really impressed by this because it turns out that I'm going to wind up using a lot of the things that I did during the remote teaching era in my in-person teaching era. because that's all part of that continuous improvement and the opportunities. So rather than being something that we had to survive or something that we had to deal with, and we certainly had to survive it and deal with it, it became something that I think has provided us with a whole bunch of different opportunities that will improve our teaching no matter where that teaching occurs. And it really boils down to rethinking everything. When we move from a plan A to a plan B, what it does is it forces us to really reevaluate what are the essential elements of our teaching and how do we modify them and improve them. And while we might have some detrimental impact by moving from in-class to remote, we also got a lot of benefits. For example, as an organization, I know the organization I'm in, I think we have a lot more technically adept instructors that can use teaching technologies like Microsoft Teams, Zoom, D2L if you chose that. You can use those technologies better than you did previously. Also, it really does fit in with educational best practices to introduce technology into teaching. And this is something we should have been doing all along. I like to think that I was doing it all along, but I really will admit, even as somebody who is a technical person, it really got amped up over the last 2 years, and I really had to lean into it hard. So, things like self-efficacy and the 21st century skill sets, critical thinking, those are all things that, they call 21st century skills. Again, they've been around forever. Critical thinking and the use of technology. Sure, the technology, we think computers, but technology in those days was things like printing presses. But the point is, it gave us, or it forced us, didn't give us the opportunity, it forced the opportunity for us to experiment, refine, and improve our teaching as a general practice. And I think that's a good takeaway. It's a good benefit. So we can say to ourselves, well, you know what? It wasn't a complete loss. It was actually, maybe we're better because of what happened, which is a shocking thing to say, but it is possibly the case. And one of the things that I found that was very useful was, and you won't be able to read the next slide, you can have this as a PDF, so you'll be able to read it when you have it on your computer. But I put the URL here as well, and it's basically guidelines for universal design, which breaks down to, engagement, representation, action, and expression. And what I was able to do is take these guidelines and look at every objective that I had in every course that I was teaching. And I asked myself, how can I assess, build, and internalize all of these things, the engagement, the representation, the action, and expression? How could I work with each of these silos and get my, the why, the what, and the how of learning, and then ensure that all of these were being met? And it is something that I would absolutely still continue to push into my classroom, because now, whether I'm teaching in person or remotely, almost every class is going to be some version of a hybrid class. I just had a quick recording error there, so I'm just back. So you may or may not have noticed that it cut out for a second there, but anyways, I'm back. So yeah, every course is going to be a version of a hybrid course. Every course is going to incorporate the things that we have been doing for years in class, but it's also going to incorporate some of the lessons that we've learned by having to go into a remote environment. And I think some of the things are there. In fact, I think what ended up happening is we wound up with a environment that we have benefits from. We have treasure. We have all sorts of different wonderful things that were given to us. Maybe we didn't ask for them. Maybe we're questioning what, the cost of the treasure, so to speak. But the truth is that we did get a lot of benefits from being forced to rethink how we deliver education, where we deliver education, and what are the core elements of ensuring that students are learning. And so we can sift through some of the stones and some of the junk that happened because of the remote teaching, the challenges, but we can also be honest with ourselves and say that there may just be some gold within all of that material that we had to go through that we can bring back into classroom training, or that we can be more adaptable to support students. One of the big treasures that I had is I had a lot of students that needed to do childcare or elder care, and they were all able to do that in the environment that we had set up for them. There was some pressures because, of course, they couldn't escape to school, but some of them were able to attend school because one of the things that I didn't get was maybe the dropout rate that I would sometimes get from students who wound up being so overwhelmed with family obligations that they were unable to attend classes and they would silently drop out or they would miss too much of the class. I was able to help them because I could record the lectures and they could catch up by participating asynchronously. A good example is I had at least 3 or 4 students. I can think of a couple right off the top of my head. Unfortunately, one had a negative event. They had a funeral that they had to attend in another country. So they had to go for almost 2 weeks to another country. They really didn't miss much of the class. They were able to, while they were in that other country, they had internet access. And while synchronous participation didn't work because of time zones, I was still in contact with those students at least once per day to make sure that they remained on track. And then I had another student who had I believe it was a wedding that they had to attend, and that they were able to accomplish that as well. The one where they had to go back for their parents' funeral was sad, but they didn't lose the learning. It's a bit of a treasure, bit of a sad treasure, but it's a treasure, right? So there are many benefits. I did find that I was able to spend not casual interaction with students like I might normally have, where we talk about movies or books or things that we're interested in or hobbies or hiking. But I did find that I did have a lot more one-on-one interaction with students because while I had the students completing a lab or performing some sort of asynchronous activity, reading, lab, whatever the exercise might be, students could contact me because I'm in class still while they're doing those things, and we could have a little one-on-one meeting where I could set them on track to make sure that they were learning. I could resource them. I could do all sorts of things. I also found that there was a lot less repetition in my class. So if I had a concept that students didn't understand the first time that I explained it, what would end up happening is either they would self-support by putting themselves into groups during the evenings and weekends. They didn't have to arrange to meet. They didn't have to arrange to meet where they had to travel. So it became difficult. There's a lot of friction in those types of meetings. They didn't have to stay after class if they had childcare to attend to. They didn't have to come in early if they had a long commute like they would with an in-class environment. They could say, let's meet tonight from 7 to 7:30. It takes me 30 seconds to connect up, 30 seconds to disconnect, so that 30 minutes that they spend meeting as a group was absolutely pure and focused. And the same applied to my one-on-one meetings with students. So that's a huge benefit. I was also able to gather a lot of data about my students. You have to be ethically, aware that you're not going to use this for nefarious. Nobody's going to use this for anything bad. But the point is, the systems do collect data on students. So if I'm sitting at the front of an in-classroom experience and students are browsing the internet and such, I don't really know what they're browsing. Whereas if I'm using something like Microsoft Teams, I know how many minutes they're spending on each of the channels in Teams. How much time are they spending in meetings? How much time are they spending in the channels? How much time are they spending in the assignment channel? So it gave me at least some insight. You have to be a bit pragmatic because students can turn off their computer and read a book. They're still learning. They could, so you have to sort of look at it that way as well. So I adapted a lot of the tools and techniques to that. And I also, I'm a technology teacher. So I've worked with computers. I have a lot of technology. I like technology, but I still learned a lot more about teaching technology through this process. So there are many benefits, many little treasures that we got. Now it is a new normal that we're going into. Some of the things that I'll be bringing back into the classroom environment is I will record lectures from now on so that I only have to lecture on a topic once. Students can watch that lecture 2 or 3 times so that they can understand it. I don't have to re-participate in the learning, so to speak. Obviously, I'm there to help the students, but a lot of times students, they just miss a demonstration or they need to watch it at 0.5 speed. Other students may want to review it at 2 times speed. All of that is facilitated by recording the lectures without me as an instructor having to repeat the concept multiple times. If you look at the YouTube channel, the slide I showed you there, the very first video that I had there came long before the remote teaching era, what happened was it was a video that I created because so many students would come back to school the next day after I gave them the assignment to create a virtual machine. And they'd be like, I can't do it. It didn't work on my system. Can you show me again? And, after showing somebody how to create a virtual machine 10 or 11 times, it starts to get a little bit, are you going to get this? But by recording it and giving them a link to the recording, they could stop and pause and stop and pause. I don't have to show them 4 or 5 times instead of 10 or 11. I obviously embraced a lot of UDL. And so I've given you the URL where you can see some of the things. I also have a bibliography of some really good books on UDL that you can check out. 21st century skills were brought in. We're going to always be incorporating those. They're just good teaching skills, things like critical thinking and making sure that students have self-efficacy, those types of things. Another thing that I'll be doing more of is remote office hours. So now if a student, if their schedule doesn't permit them to be on campus during my office hours, they'll be able to dial in and get me on a Teams meeting. So we'll still have the same video. We'll still be able to interact. It'll still be a meaningful interaction, and it'll be beneficial to both the student and myself because it's going to be using better use of that time. Also, I feel like I save flexibility to reach more learners. We're going to be able to increase the catchment area of the people that we're training. Online training and distance education was statistically it was a statistically significant amount of people that came from different socioeconomic backgrounds, that were visible minorities, and that were that had female versus male. More people that would not be able to attend in class for whatever socioeconomic reasons will now be able to attend class. I think that's a great new normal. And choice. Students will be able to choose between either attending a class or watching a class and participating remotely. And I shouldn't say watching. It sounds like they're not participating, but the difference of being physically present, I don't care whether we're remote or whether we're in the classroom. I want students to be mentally present no matter where they are, right? So here's a number of different resources. I have a big PDF with a lot of links in it. I have a podcast where I talk about different concepts and ideas around learning. I have my channel on YouTube, which is Learning and Technology with Frank. I have a list of lots of books and things that I'm looking at. I can create more. I don't want to overwhelm you, but there's already about 50 or 60 books there, and I probably have another 30 or so sitting on the shelf here that I didn't put on there. I'm thinking like Small Teaching is a good one. Actually, I should put both of those on there. Anyways, lots of resources for you. There is a PDF available. There's the link down below, or that you can just click the link if you have the slideshow here. Okay, thank you so much for watching. I hope that was interesting to you, and we'll see you in the next presentation if you're so inclined.